Welcome back to the Sage Audio channel. Today we'll be discussing mastering dialogue for podcasts. We'll be offering some insight of the processing that you can use to master it, the role harmonics play when mastering dialogue, how loud your dialogue should be based on the streaming service that you're distributing to, and if you should normalize your dialogue. We'll also listen to a before and after example, so stick around for the full video, but first, if you're an artist, engineer, or producer and you have a mix that you need mastered, send it to us at sageaudio.com. We'll master it for you and send you a free mastered sample of it. All you gotta do is set up this short account, upload the song, and we can do the rest. So how do you master dialogue for podcasts? Well, when you're mastering your dialogue, if you do choose to do it yourself, use these forms of processing and in this order. The first is subtractive equalization. Now this is used to attenuate any aspects of the vocal that you don't like or you don't find sonically balanced. Some good frequencies to attenuate are the frequencies below 80 Hz, which you can use a high-pass filter for, 500 to 900 Hz, which you can use a Bell filter with a Q of roughly 1.4, and sibilance-based frequencies, and these will depend on the speaker. The next step is to use compression. Now this is used to control the dynamics of the vocal so that the volume sounds more uniform throughout the entirety of the performance. Now if the vocal is shrill, you can use a quicker attack and a longer release to smooth out some of the transients. If the vocal sounds dull, use a longer attack and a shorter release to ensure that more detail gets through the compressor. Now the next step is optional, and that's to use harmonic generation. Now this effect is accomplished using analog emulation plugins, and at lower levels it can be really beneficial to the sound of your master. Significant harmonic generation will become taxing to the listener over time, so don't use more than 1% total harmonic distortion on a dialogue recording. The next step is de-essing. Now this is a form of compression that's designed to attenuate sibilance specifically. Now it may not be needed, but it most likely will. Now when you're using de-essing, you can use a split band setting, which will result in more accurate and precise de-essing. Whereas if you were to use a wide band setting, it'll sound more natural at lower levels of attenuation. The next step is to use additive equalization. At this point, you can add in some of the aspects that you enjoy or that augment the sound and balance out the dialogue. Now, wider band settings sound more natural, so try using Qs of less than 2.8, which is about a half of an octave, to achieve a more realistic and unprocessed sound. The last step when you're mastering your dialogue is limiting. Now, limiting is a form of compression that drastically attenuates the signal prior to its peaking. Limiters ensure that clipping distortion doesn't occur, however, they should be used sparingly. Now, a tip when you're using a limiter is to use a limiter with algorithmic options for different characteristics and tonality. For example, the FabFilter L2 limiter has a setting specifically designed for podcasts. So let's listen to this processing added in one form at a time so we can get a good idea as to what we're doing. Welcome back to the Sage Audio channel. Today we thought we'd try something different and do an in-depth analysis of a free, a cheap, and an expensive EQ plugins at very different prices, and then make a decision for what's actually worth your time and money. Now the three plugins that we're covering today are the TinyQ by LJKB plugins, the Renaissance EQ by Waves Audio, and the Pro Q3 by FabFilter. We'll consider things like CPU usage, if the plugin generates harmonics, if the plugin has any adverse or unwanted effects on the signal, the general functionality of the plugin, the aesthetics of the interface and the design, and of course, the cost. Now we're also going to be listening to some examples of the plugin on a full mix, so stick around for the full video. But first, if you're an artist, an engineer, or producer, and you have a mix that you need mastered, send it to us at sageaudio.com. We'll master it for you and send you a free mastered sample of it. Now all you got to do is set up the short account, upload the song, and we can do the rest. Now the next thing that I want to talk about is, can harmonics and distortion improve the tone of dialogue? In short, yes, harmonics or mild distortions can improve the tonality of your dialogue by making it sound more complex and louder. Now when you're applying harmonic distortion to a dialogue recording, it's best to do so at very low levels, otherwise the recording may become fatiguing for listeners. Now when mastering music, saturation and harmonic distortion is often used to make music sound fuller. The reason it does this is because harmonics fill the gaps in the frequency spectrum, as well as combine with and amplify the existing frequencies in that spectrum. Now, with that said, it can make music or dialogue sound great. However, whereas using a lot of harmonic generation on music can work well, the same cannot be said for dialogue. Now, when using harmonic generation, it's best to keep the total harmonic distortion under 1%, or even less if possible. So plugins that include a THD meter will be really helpful. Also, it's best to use your ears and to listen to the effect critically when you're setting distortion settings. Lastly, there's a big difference between distortion plugins and saturation plugins. Now, whereas distortion plugins will only create harmonics, saturation will both compress your signal and create harmonics. Now, although this concept is a little more complex given a lot of variables, the main thing to understand is that saturation is the combination of both compression and distortion. Now, with this in mind, using saturation and a separate compression plugin may cause too much compression and make your vocals sound too controlled dynamically. Next, let's consider how loud your dialogue should be. Now, how loud your dialogue should be truly depends on the streaming service or platform to which you plan to distribute your music. Now, some services, including Spotify, use a process called loudness normalization, which will affect how loud your podcast is played back when it's streamed by listeners. Now, with that in mind, let's look at various streaming services and determine how loud you should master your dialogue if you intend to release it on that particular streaming service. Also, it helps to know what meter that you should be using when you're measuring your loudness. So for this, use an integrated LUFS meter. First, let's look at Spotify. Now, Spotify does use loudness normalization, and it will normalize your audio to an integrated -14 LUFS. Now, this means that despite how loud you might make your dialogue, it will reset to this particular loudness. Now, with this in mind, it makes the most sense to master your dialogue quieter than -14 LUFS. Now, when it comes to Apple Music, they normalize your audio to an integrated -16 LUFS. Now, this means that you shouldn't master your dialogue to much louder than -16 LUFS. Now, if you want to have your podcast on both Spotify and Apple Music, mastering your dialogue to under 16 LUFS will work fine. When it comes to Tidal, they normalize audio to -16 LUFS. Now, with that in mind, the same thoughts about Apple Music apply for Tidal. When it comes to SoundCloud, they don't use loudness normalization. Now, this means that the loudness at which you export your master is going to be the same loudness that listeners hear it. Still, in this instance, it's best to master under the loudness normalization settings. The reason being, listeners expect this loudness due to the popularity of streaming services that we just mentioned. Now, if you master louder than it, it may be off-putting to some listeners. Now, with all this in mind, it's best not to master your dialogue louder than -16 LUFS. In fact, we recommend roughly -20 to -18 LUFS. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about is whether or not you should normalize your dialogue in your DAW. Now, in short, no. You should not normalize your dialogue when you're mixing or you're mastering or recording for a podcast. Now, normalizing your audio will, more likely than not, have a negative effect on the quality of your recording and may make your dialogue far too loud for listeners. Now, you may have noticed the option to normalize your audio when you're exporting it and wondered what this means exactly. Well, although there are a couple types of normalization, loudness normalization being one that we just mentioned, the type most often used in DAWs is peak normalization. Now, peak normalization increases the volume of the entire track using a peak setting, which is usually 0 dB, as the highest point the audio will reach. So for example, say you have a dialogue recording that has its loudest peak at -10 dB. If you were to use peak normalization, the entire recording would be turned up by 10 dB to make that loudest peak 0 dB. Now, although peak normalization can be set to a lower number, most quick normalization settings will use 0 dB as the peak normalization setting. In this particular example, the loudness of your dialogue is increased dramatically, resulting in an integrated LUFS that is most likely much louder than it should be. Now again, remember, when dialogue is too loud, it can be very unpleasant or off-putting to listeners. Another thing to consider is something called intersample clipping distortion. Intersample clipping distortion is when the signal becomes louder than 0 dB in between the audio samples. Now, this is a common occurrence and can definitely cause fidelity issues with your dialogue. Essentially, when your recording is uploaded to a distribution platform, or even an online streaming service like YouTube or SoundCloud, the encoding process affects the amplitude of the recording. Now, during encoding, the amplitude of the recording can be affected up to 0.5 dB. Now, this means that if you were to normalize your dialogue to 0 dB, you can cause both clipping and intersample clipping distortion. Again, this isn't something that you want, as this type of distortion does not have a pleasant tonality and can be easily perceived by listeners. So, in short, do not use peak normalization to affect the volume or the level of your dialogue. So these are our thoughts on mastering dialogue for a podcast, but what do you think? Leave your thoughts in the comment section below. Also, if you're an artist or an engineer, send us one of your mixes at sageaudio.com. We'll master it for you and send you a free mastered sample. All you gotta do is set up the Short account, upload the song, and we can do the rest. But thank you so much for watching. We really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like and share this video with your friends. This way we know if you'd like to see more videos like this one. Also, you can subscribe to the channel. We release new videos every week, and subscribing is the best way to stay up to date. There's a comment section where you can leave your thoughts on this video or a suggestion for a future video. And again, if you're an artist or an engineer and you have a mix that you need mastered, send it to us at sageaudio.com. We'll master it for you and send you a free mastered sample. Thank you again so much for watching. We'll see you in the next video.